August 12, 1942. Chesapeake Bay Naval Proving Ground, Maryland. Before sunrise, while fog still clung to the water like cold breath, a man with no public name passed through 6 lock gates and 3 steel corridors carved into reinforced concrete. His papers carried only clearance numbers. His escort spoke only when ordered. To the guards, he was not a civilian and not an officer. He was simply the specialist, and whatever he carried in the black case chained to his wrist was deemed more valuable than any single life on the base. Beyond the last blast door, the harbor opened into view, and through the thinning mist rose the dark, unfinished silhouette of an Iowa-class battleship, its hull towering like a steel cliff against the pale morning sky. The giant guns were not yet mounted, but the empty barbettes already pointed toward the sea like waiting eyes. Within a year, those barrels would be able to hurl shells weighing more than a truck across 20 miles of open water. And every man on that base knew the brutal truth that had driven this project into frantic existence. At close range, those same guns could shatter any armor humanity had yet forged. The Metallurgist halted at the edge of the pier and stared at the hull for several long seconds. He did not admire it. He measured it. He imagined shockwaves racing through the hidden layers of steel. He imagined cracks that no eye could see. He imagined what would happen when the laws of physics met the confidence of men who believed they could finally outrun them. And it was here, in this quiet moment beside cold water and silent steel, that the race against battleship guns truly began. If stories like this pull you into the hidden heartbeat of war, take a second to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you are watching from around the world. Every frontline has a witness, and your location becomes part of this living map of history. Inside the furnace halls, heat already trembled through the air. Steel plates waited on rolling racks like condemned prisoners. Each carried months of failed theory in its grain. Each would be fed into fire, reshaped, and sent out to be tested by violence measured in thousands of feet per second. For nearly a year, every formulation had ended the same way. First deformation, then catastrophic rupture. Naval construction schedules advanced. Enemy shipyards advanced. The steel never caught up. The metallurgist task had been worded simply in Washington. Create armor that can survive a direct hit from battleship guns. The men who signed the orders knew exactly how impossible it sounded. The men who built the furnaces knew how many had already failed. The man who now stepped into the glow of molten steel knew something none of them did. For weeks he worked without an official name attached to his notes. He altered carbon ratios by fractions invisible to standard charts. He introduced trace elements in combinations that no approved doctrine allowed. To the technicians, he seemed reckless. To the officers, he seemed unnaturally calm. To the steel itself, he was whispering instructions written in a language older than war. Day after day, test plates were cast, cooled, mounted, and destroyed. Explosives bloomed against them. High-velocity rounds punched into them. Most shattered like glass. Some peeled like bark. A few bent, then tore themselves apart from the inside. The failures piled up in twisted heaps, hauled away under tarps before visiting officials arrived to tour the facilities. Each failure was logged. Each success, no matter how minor, was classified deeper than the last. Late one night, long after the furnaces should have gone dark, a single test plate emerged from the cooling bay bearing scars no other had survived. It had been struck at full design velocity. It had not shattered. It had not ruptured. It had bent. Its edges were split and scorched. But the central mass remained whole. Most of the night shift believed the result to be a statistical fluke. Steel sometimes behaved strangely under stress. The naval engineers demanded replication. The officers demanded silence. Only the metallurgist asked for a microscope. Under magnification, the steel revealed a tangled internal structure unlike anything in the existing manuals. Grain boundaries curved and intertwined in patterns that distributed force instead of concentrating it. Microscopic cracks were present, but their growth had been arrested repeatedly by layered crystalline resistance. It was not invincible. It was disciplined. Within days, The first full-scale test was authorized under the authority of the United States Navy and conducted in restricted waters off the Atlantic coast. Barges carried the test bulkhead into open sea. A full-weight armor-piercing shell was hoisted into the breech of a long-range naval gun. The distance was calculated. The angle was precise. Nothing about the shot was symbolic. It was meant to replicate the moment when two battleships aimed directly at each other with murderous certainty. When the gun fired, the shock rolled across the water like thunder trapped inside iron. The shell struck the plate dead center. A flare of light burst outward. Smoke swallowed the bulkhead. Observers waited for fragments to arc through the air the way they always had before. When the smoke cleared, the plate was still standing. The shell had broken apart on contact. The steel wore a vast glowing crater, but it had not been penetrated. The bulkhead behind it was intact. For several stunned seconds, no one spoke. Then the range erupted in controlled disbelief. Officers shook hands. Engineers shouted confirmation calls into field radios. The impossible, at least on paper, had just happened. The metallurgist did not join them. He studied the color of the impact zone. He noted the way the metal had rippled rather than split. He knelt and traced a scorched fracture at the crater's rim with a gloved finger. The plate had survived, but it had not done so cleanly. The Navy needed immunity. What it had been given was endurance. Production orders were issued within days. The alloy was approved before long-term cyclic stress testing could be completed. Iowa-class hulls, already rising along East Coast shipyards, were scheduled to receive the new armor formulation across vital zones. Timetables collapsed under urgency. Steel mills shifted entire output to satisfy the demand. By early 1943, multiple Iowa-class battleship hulls slid into the water armored with this new material, each launch greeted by flags, speeches, and the growing belief that American capital ships had just crossed a threshold no enemy gun could follow. Enemy analysts, watching from afar, struggled to explain reports of failed penetrations that violated pre-war ballistic assumptions. Within secure facilities, however, the metallurgist watched stress charts accumulate with a tightening focus. Repeated impact simulations began to reveal something else beneath the surface. Each blow left behind microscopic damage invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under precision instruments. Fractures did not grow as expected. They migrated. They bent. They waited. In his private calculations, the steel was behaving less like traditional armor and more like a patient load-bearing organism. It absorbed punishment not by resisting it absolutely, but by redirecting it internally along paths of least catastrophe. Each strike made the next more dangerous. The law of cumulative failure had not been defeated. It had only been slowed. And yet the most dangerous truth was still unseen by the officers celebrating above him in offices lined with charts of enemy fleets. The core principle behind the alloy had not been born on American soil. Months earlier, fragments of technical notes had reached his hands through channels that did not appear on any supply ledger. They were scorched at the edges, written in hurried notations, translated twice before arriving. They described a European experimental steel developed under conditions of extreme secrecy, then lost when its laboratory vanished in a bombing raid whose official damage report listed only rubble and casualties. The scientists who had authored those equations were never recovered. Their final margin notes, preserved like warnings etched into ash, spoke of unstable microstructures that resisted initial failure but carried unknown consequences under repeated naval-scale stress. The metallurgist had incorporated their theory anyway. War had not asked his permission. It had demanded his results. Now, as Iowa hulls advanced toward completion and crews were already being assigned future gun stations, he began to understand that the true test of his alloy would not be controlled, scheduled, or merciful. It would come amid smoke and fire, amid broken radios and flooding compartments, amid human panic at depths where steel either held or it did not. For now, the steel passed every official benchmark, and that was enough for the men who made deployment schedules. But inside classified folders that never left his possession, the metallurgist charted something no celebration accounted for. A countdown measured not in minutes or days, but in impacts. And the ocean, vast and patient, was already waiting for the next one. By the spring of 1943, the new armor was no longer a secret discussed only inside reinforced rooms. It had become a silent assumption embedded into every future battle plan. The belief was simple and dangerously comforting. American battleships could now take punishment that would shatter any other steel afloat. Shipyard workers whispered it. Naval engineers wrote it in shaded language across test summaries. Somewhere between optimism and necessity, the word immune began to circulate. At coastal proving grounds and offshore ranges, impact tests multiplied. Plates were struck again and again by full-weight armor-piercing shells. At long range, the steel shrugged off the blows with only scarred surfaces. At medium range, it dented but refused to tear. At short range, where physics had always asserted its authority without exception, the new alloy still endured. Each impact sent shockwaves through the water. Each recovery team expected to find catastrophic failure waiting beneath the smoke. And each time, the plate was still standing. Data flowed into naval laboratories by the ton. Velocity curves bent away from expected penetration thresholds. Energy transfer behaved against established models. The accepted equations governing steel under extreme pressure began to unravel under the weight of experimental contradiction. What had once been theoretical limits were now merely obstacles the metal seemed to negotiate rather than obey. Above the charts and fracture photographs, officers envisioned Iowa-class battleships charging into gun duels that would have been suicidal only a year earlier. In quiet strategy sessions, planners began recalculating fleet tactics around a single premise. Give these ships the confidence to close distance. Let them absorb the first volley. Let them bring their guns to bear while other navies hesitated. In the same weeks that this confidence solidified, the metallurgist withdrew further into the margins of the project. He remained present at tests. His approval signature continued to appear on material certifications. But his private calculations told a different story. Under magnification, each successful plate showed a dense web of internal scars. The cracks were not growing outward in the familiar brittle patterns of ordinary armor. They folded back into the crystalline structure and hid themselves. The steel was learning to survive. And, in learning, it was changing. At the height of the Navy's confidence in the new armor, when the phrase battleship-proof began appearing in classified correspondence, the narrator notes that this is the moment to pause and reflect. If hidden stories of war and forgotten science shape the way you see history, now is the time to subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. The front lines of memory stretch across every continent. Behind the test results, the unpublicized truth lay buried in the metallurgist's locked workbooks. The core arrangement of grain boundaries that allowed the alloy to dissipate energy so effectively had not emerged from months of American experimentation. It had arrived, fully formed in theory, long before the first domestic furnace had ever been tuned to receive it. The fragments had come through untraceable channels, a mangled technical manuscript, half burned at the edges, a set of mechanical diagrams missing their headers, a sequence of handwritten equations annotated in a style no American laboratory employed. The documents traced their origin to a European research site that no longer appeared on any strategic map. Official reconnaissance photographs showed only a jagged crater where the facility had stood. The bombers had done their work too completely for questions to survive. The scientists who designed the original alloy did not appear on any casualty list. Their names were absent from both enemy propaganda and Allied recovery records. They had vanished between the impact of explosives and the collection of ruins. Only their math remained. The final notes they left behind carried warnings that were neither dramatic nor absolute. The steel they described resisted immediate rupture in unprecedented fashion, but its internal microstructure displayed delayed failure behavior under repeated extreme stress. The equations predicted that propagation would not be progressive. It would be sudden. A chain reaction at the microscopic level could, under the right alignment of forces, convert the armor from a near-perfect shield into a single unified fracture plane. The metallurgist had read those margins. He had chosen to proceed anyway. War demanded what caution resisted. During the summer of 1943, the new alloy entered full-scale production. Mills along the coast shifted entire output lines to its formula. Rail shipments moved day and night beneath blackout conditions. Plate after plate rolled off furnaces and traveled toward ships whose keels already cut through Atlantic water. Battle readiness charts lit up with projected survivability numbers that would have been dismissed as propaganda before the test results began to confirm them. When the first Iowa-class battleships equipped with the new armor completed their sea trials, observers noted how gunnery officers behaved differently on deck. The usual caution that accompanied capital ships in narrow waters gave way to something closer to confidence than protocol required. Crews trained under the assumption that their hulls were no longer fragile boundaries between life and flooding. They became barriers that could be trusted to endure. At the emotional peak of this belief, as unsinkable legends quietly began their ascent through the fleet, the narrator once more addresses the unseen audience. If you are watching from anywhere in the world where the ocean still carries the echoes of great guns, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and leave a comment telling us your location. History travels farther than fleets ever could. But beneath the surface of triumph, the steel was keeping its own record. With each high-velocity impact, new microscopic junctions formed where fractures met, aligned, and then arrested themselves again. The metal behaved less like layered armor and more like a compressed spring that had learned to hold under punishment by redirecting stress through maze-like channels in its crystalline lattice. The problem was not that it broke. It was that it learned. In conventional armor, each successive impact weakens the plate in predictable fashion. Engineers can estimate when failure will occur because damage accumulates in visible increments. This alloy did not follow those rules. Its damage accumulation followed a nonlinear path. For long periods, additional stress added little apparent degradation. Then, as internal structures reached critical alignment, minute additions of force carried disproportionate consequence. The metallurgist mapped those invisible thresholds in isolation. He knew that a ship in combat would never experience evenly spaced, laboratory-controlled strikes. It would endure clusters of impacts localized around magazines, turrets, and vital compartments. The equations from the vanished European laboratory had predicted precisely that scenario. They called it convergence. Late in 1943, the convergence theory moved from abstraction to practiced reality. A classified live-fire exercise was ordered to validate the armor's behavior under rapid sequential strikes. The test was conducted well outside standard proof ranges. The target was not a suspended plate or a test bulkhead. It was an armored section assembled according to full battleship specifications. The shell charges were not reduced. Neither was the firing distance. The first shell struck and left a vast scorched crater. The second impacted within yards of the first and deepened the deformation without breach. Range officers reported both as successes. The third shell was fired before full thermal dissipation from the second impact had occurred. The steel held. Cheers erupted across the control platforms. The new armor had just survived conditions that every ballistic table declared impossible. Test officials proclaimed the experiment a resounding validation. Telemetry data raced across secure cables to command centers that would soon translate it into aggressive future planning. At the exact moment the third shell failed to penetrate and confidence reached its zenith, the narrator presses the audience once more. For stories that reveal how close history came to unseen catastrophe, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and leave your location in the comments so the record of this moment spans a globe. The metallurgist did not join the celebration. On his instruments, the internal stress readings formed a pattern he had hoped never to see outside theoretical modeling. The third impact had aligned multiple microfracture nodes into a continuous stress corridor buried deep within the steel's interior layers. The armor had not survived by strength alone. It had survived because the internal chain reaction had stopped one molecular step short of total linkage. He ordered the range shut down within minutes. The firing sequence was halted under procedural irregularity code. The test supervisors protested. The admirals demanded justification. The failure had not occurred. The steel had proven its worth. Why stop now? Because the next shot would not behave like the last three. He explained that the armor had reached a critical internal geometry in which further high-energy impacts carried unpredictable catastrophic potential. The steel was no longer accumulating damage in independent pockets. It was approaching a unified failure plane. One more convergent strike could collapse the entire stress network at once. His report was sealed. His language was deliberately restrained. He avoided absolutes. He avoided declaring disaster certain. He allowed the possibility of continued survival. But beneath the formality of classification phrasing lay the unmistakable warning. The alloy was no longer being tested at the edge of known behavior. It had crossed into the realm of unstable equilibrium. At this chilling juncture, as conscience collided with command authority, the narrator again turns outward. If hidden warnings, buried reports, and the thin line between triumph and tragedy keep you watching, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and add your voice by commenting where you're watching from right now. The response from above was swift and final. The test section had passed its required validation parameters. The fleet needed armor giants immediately. Wartime risk tolerance had little patience for theoretical catastrophe. The report was archived under deep restriction. Production continued without alteration of alloy composition. By the end of 1943, armored Iowa hulls were entering active combat zones. Crews were briefed on their unprecedented survivability. Enemy intelligence services, intercepting fragments of battle damage assessments, struggled to reconcile repeated failed penetrations with established naval physics. Shells that should have gutted battleships were instead shattering on impact. The myth of immunity migrated silently from blueprint to battlefield. And still, beneath the waterline and behind the paint of victory, the Metallurgist's unseen countdown continued with every enemy volley that struck American steel. He alone knew that the alloy's greatest strength hid its greatest danger. It did not fail gradually. It waited. The ocean, patient as ever, awaited the moment when theory and violence would finally meet without prediction to restrain them. By early 1944, the new armor was no longer an experiment. It was a silent assumption riding beneath thousands of sailors as Iowa-class battleships crossed into active war zones. Steel that had survived controlled violence now faced chaos. In the Pacific and the Atlantic alike, enemy gunnery calculations remained trapped in pre-war physics. Shells were aimed to penetrate where penetration had always been guaranteed. Time after time, the shells failed to pass through. After-action reports told the same story in restrained language. Severe impact, heavy deformation, no breach. Damage control crews expected flooding and instead found scorched plates and twisted framing that still held back the sea. To the men inside those hulls, the armor became more than material. It became belief. Across operational headquarters, risk models quietly shifted. Ships pressed closer into danger. Engagement envelopes tightened. Battleships closed distances once considered reckless. The armor had created a new battlefield geometry not by altering guns, but by changing what commanders believed their ships could survive. Far from the bridge wings and gun turrets, one man watched each engagement from behind layers of classified reporting. He traced every hit location, every shell weight, every angle of impact. With each new data point, his private models grew more precise and more unsettling. The alloy continued to hold. And with every successful defense, the internal convergence he feared crept closer toward perfect alignment. Beneath the paint and beneath the praise, the steel was evolving under pressure. In mid-1944, A heavy engagement in contested waters subjected an Iowa-class battleship to a concentration of fire far denser than any test range had ever authorized. Multiple salvos struck within a confined region along the armored belt. Observers recorded violent surface damage. The sea around the ship churned white from near misses and explosive shock. By every known equation, the armor should have failed. It did not. The damage report reached command as a triumph of engineering. Photographs showed torn outer surfaces and massive cratering, but no catastrophic rupture. The crew credited the new armor with their survival. Command credited design foresight. Newspapers were given fragments of the story sanitized for morale. The myth hardened. But within the Metallurgist's locked files, the telemetry told a different tale. Deep inside the steel, stress corridors had intersected along precisely the vectors predicted by vanished European equations. Multiple microfracture networks had merged into a single dominant plane that now spanned an enormous section of the armor's interior. The plate had not failed because it had redirected the destructive energy into a unified internal architecture that temporarily balanced force against itself. The steel had survived by becoming brittle in a way no external instrument could see. At this threshold, the alloy was no longer simply resisting force. It was storing the memory of every impact like a compressed ledger of violence. Each subsequent strike no longer carved new independent scars. It fed an existing internal narrative that approached completion one collision at a time. The metallurgist knew that when that narrative finished writing itself, the failure would not announce its arrival with progressive warning. It would arrive as a single instant. He submitted one final sealed memorandum, requesting structural review and revised fire engagement protocols for armored capital ships. The memo was marked for deferred evaluation and routed into wartime backlog. Fleet movements could not wait for metallurgical uncertainty. The war would be decided before hypothetical catastrophe could be proven. Within months, Iowa-class battleships were participating in some of the heaviest sustained naval bombardments in history. Their guns reshaped shorelines. Their silhouettes became symbols of unstoppable advance. Enemy batteries struck back with everything they had left. The armor endured through shock after shock. Among the crews, the belief in immunity crossed from confidence into ritual. Some men touched the interior steel before battle, as if it carried luck. Some joked that they rode inside a floating fortress no gun could breach. In that belief, morale strengthened. And in that strength, they fought harder than steel alone could ever compel. But iron does not share human faith. Late in the war, during an engagement whose full records remained sealed under classification exemptions that outlived the conflict itself, one Iowa-class ship absorbed a shell impact along an already battered section of its armored belt. The shell did not penetrate. It detonated against the surface, as so many had before. Smoke poured across the deck. The sea closed around the hull once more. Externally, the damage appeared consistent with prior survivals. Internally, sensors recorded a transient stress spike that departed sharply from every previous profile. The wave propagated across a unified internal fracture plane and collapsed, dissipating without visible breach. The ship remained afloat. The battle continued. No catastrophic failure was observed. The metallurgist read that report with a stillness that no one else on the project recognized. The alloy had reached full convergence. From that moment onward, the armor no longer behaved as layered resistance. It behaved as a single stressed organism whose survival depended on the precise geometry of every future strike. One deviation in angle, one convergence at a weaker intersection, one shell placed just differently enough. Any of these could initiate total collapse across the hidden internal plane. Whether that ultimate alignment ever arrived remains sealed within archives that have never been fully opened to public record. Damage summaries for certain late-war engagements contain ambiguities that historians still debate. Some anomalies suggest internal phenomena that do not conform to traditional armor failure modes. Others can be explained by conventional blast effects, equipment malfunction, or reporting error. What remains certain is this: no Iowa-class battleship was ever lost to enemy gunfire during the war. What remains uncertain is how narrow that margin truly was. The Metallurgist did not survive long enough to see the final post-war analyses declassified. His files were absorbed into naval research institutions whose successors would inherit the equations without ever knowing the full fear that once accompanied them. The vanished European scientists who first warned of convergence remained nameless shadows behind one of the most resilient warship designs in history. Today, the armor that once stopped battleship guns rests in museum sections and rusting hulls. Children run their hands along plates that once held back energies capable of shattering cities. They feel only cold steel. They do not feel the invisible countdown that once lived within that metal, suspended between endurance and collapse. History records the Iowa class as immune. Physics records only that they were never forced to prove otherwise beyond the final threshold. And somewhere between those two narratives, the truth remains suspended like stress inside forgotten steel. If stories like this remind you how close history often comes to unseen catastrophe, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us where you are watching from around the world. Every comment becomes part of a living record of those who still listen to the echoes beneath the surface of steel and sea.